Eleanor Ashworth had learned, over 28 years, that the surest way to be left alone was to be useful and plain at the same time. So on the morning the great man was to come, she did not stand at the mirror. She put on the faded dove-gray gown, the one worn soft at the elbows, and she braided her dark hair into a low, unadorned knot. And she went down to the stables in the cold to see that the horses were fed, because no one else at Farknoll would remember to do it. The estate was falling quietly to ruin around her. The roof of the east wing had let go in the autumn storms, and the money to mend it had gone the way of all the Ashworth money. Into her father's debts, into her stepmother's card tables, into the long, slow bleeding of a great house that had outlived its fortune. Eleanor did not weep over it. She had stopped weeping years ago. She kept the ledgers, and she kept the horses, and she kept her spine straight, and she waited to be married off to a stranger to save them all. What she did not know, as she crossed the frost-bitten yard that grey morning, was that the stranger had already come. He had come the night before, a day early, in a mud-stained servant's coat, with a great iron-grey wolfhound at his heel that no man alive could approach. And he had spent the whole of that first night listening at Farknoll's cold walls to the thing that would change everything. The stables were the warmest place at Farknoll, and Eleanor loved them for it. The old grey mare pushed her soft nose into Eleanor's palm, and Eleanor breathed in the smell of hay and worn leather, and let herself, for one quiet moment, be at peace. Thomas the groom was already there, forking down fresh straw, his hands stiff with the cold and the years. He did not say good morning. He never did. But he set aside the best of the oats for the mare without being asked, because he knew Eleanor loved her. And that was how Thomas said all the things he could not put into words. "There's a new man come," Thomas said at last, low, not looking up. "Last night, in the rain. Says he's sent ahead by the Duke's household to see the place made ready." Eleanor's hand stilled on the mare's neck. So it had begun. She had thought she had another day. She found she was glad to be wrong. The waiting had been the worst of it. She had known it was coming. Her father had told her a fortnight past, over the ruin of a dinner in the ruin of a dining room, that the Duke of Velmoor had need of a wife, and Farknoll had need of a fortune, and that the two of them, being reasonable people, had struck a reasonable bargain. Eleanor had said nothing. She had folded her hands in her lap and looked at the guttering candle and understood, in a single flat moment, exactly what she was. Not a daughter to be loved, a debt to be paid, in the only coin a plain girl of ruined family had left to her herself. Her father had not been able to meet her eyes. He had turned the stem of his glass round and round on the stained cloth, and she had watched him do it, and she had felt, strangely, more pity for him than for herself. He was a weak man drowning, and he had reached for the nearest thing that would float, and the nearest thing was his daughter. "You'll not embarrass us," her stepmother had said afterward on the stairs, in the voice she kept for Eleanor alone. "A duke, above your station by a mile. God knows what he wants with you, when he could have any beauty in England. Try not to speak over much." Eleanor had said quietly that she would try, and she had gone to bed and lain awake, and listened to the wind find every broken slate in the roof, and she had done what she always did with a grief too large to carry. She had set it down, piece by piece, and picked up instead the small solid things she could still hold. The horses to be fed, the great-aunt's medicine to be measured, the ledger to be balanced against a fortune that no longer existed. Small things, steady things. A woman could stand a great deal if she only kept her hands busy and her spine straight, and did not let herself imagine, ever, a life in which she had been wanted for herself. Now she left the stables and went in to face the household, and the new servant was in the yard. She saw him from across the frost-silvered cobbles and stopped without meaning to. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulder, in a plain labourer's coat gone brown with old mud, splitting kindling by the kitchen door as though he had done it all his life, and at his side, sitting motionless as a carved thing, was the largest dog Eleanor had ever seen. An iron-grey wolfhound, rough-coated, with eyes the colour of a winter sky, watching her come across the yard with a still and terrible attention. Agnes, the kitchen maid, had already whispered the warning through the whole house. The beast had near taken the gardener's hand off at dawn for coming too close. No one was to go near it. Eleanor, who had never in her life been able to leave a frightened creature alone, walked straight toward it. She could see it was not vicious. She could see it was only guarding, the way she guarded, the way anything guards when it has learned the world will hurt it if it lets its guard down. "You'll want to keep back from him, miss," the new man said. And there was something in his voice that did not fit the coat, too used to being obeyed. "He doesn't take to strangers." But Eleanor had stopped a careful pace away and gone very still, the way she went still with any wary animal, and she did not reach for the dog, and she did not look it in the eye, and she simply stood quiet, letting it take the measure of her. The wolfhound rose, the man's hand moved too slow, and the great grey dog crossed the space between them and pressed its huge rough head, gentle as a whisper, against Eleanor's grey skirts, and let out a long breath, and leaned its whole weight against her, as though it had been waiting a long time to do exactly that. For a moment, no one spoke. Eleanor laid her hand on the vast head. The man in the servant's coat stood frozen, staring at her, at his own impossible dog, as though the ground had shifted under him. "Well," Eleanor said softly, more to the dog than to the man, "you're not so fierce, are you? You're only lonely." She scratched the rough grey ear, and the wolfhound's tail thumped once against the cobbles, and Thomas, watching from the stable door, made a small sound that might have been a laugh. The new servant found his voice. "That has not happened," he said slowly, "in 3 years. Eleanor glanced up at him then, really looking for the first time, and found him watching her with an expression she could not read, not the amused contempt she was used to from grand men's servants, but something startled and searching, and almost wounded. She looked away first, as a plain girl learns to. "He knows I mean him no harm," she said simply. "Animals always know. It's people who need convincing." And she gave the dog a last gentle pat, and went into the cold house, and did not see the man stand a long time in the yard, forgetting entirely to split the wood, his eyes following the grey gown until the kitchen door closed behind it. His name, he told the household, was Mr. Grey. He would see to the readying of the house against the Duke's arrival on the morrow, and he would sleep in the servants' hall, and he would keep to himself. The stepmother, Lady Ashworth, barely glanced at him. A servant was furniture to her. Less than furniture. A thing that fetched and carried. And so it was that the Duke of Velmoor walked freely through the ruin of Farknoll for a full day and a night, unseen for what he was, watching them all, the vain stepmother rehearsing her smiles, the two pretty stepsisters, Cassandra and Maria, being laced into borrowed finery, the baronet drinking himself brave in the library, and the plain grey daughter, no one mentioned, moving quietly through it all, mending what she could, keeping the whole broken house standing on the strength of her two steady hands. He had thought disguise a clever, cold stratagem. He had not understood yet that it would show him a thing he could never afterward unsee. Dominic, Duke of Velmoor, had not intended to be moved by anything at Farknoll. He had come north with a cold and simple purpose. His grandmother, the old dowager, had at last worn him down. He must marry. The line must go on, and if he would not choose, then a bride would be chosen for him from among the ambitious families who wanted a duke's coronet more than they wanted the man beneath it. He had chosen Farknoll precisely because it was ruined, the family desperate, the girl unknown, the transaction honest in its way. He wanted no love. He had loved once, 5 years past, and buried her in the spring, and buried with her every soft thing he had ever been. Her name had been Clara, and she had died of a fever in 3 days that ought to have been nothing, and he had stood at her graveside in the wet April earth, and felt something in him freeze solid and vow, quietly, never to thaw again. He had come to inspect a bargain, the way a man inspects a horse before he buys it. He had not come to be undone by a plain woman in a grey gown who spoke to a broken dog as though it were the only honest soul in the house. That first night, unable to sleep, he had walked the cold corridors of Farknoll with Bran padding silent at his heel, and he had overheard things. He had heard Lady Ashworth, through a half-closed door, instructing her daughters in exactly how to behave before the Duke. How to laugh, how to lean, how to make Eleanor look drab and slow beside their brightness. He'll take one look at the pair of you, she had purred, and forget the arrangement entirely. A duke can break a betrothal to a nobody. He cannot be made to marry a plain stick of a girl if a prettier one is put in front of him. And Dominic, standing in the dark with his hand in the great dog's ruff, had understood the whole shape of the household's plot, and had felt, to his own surprise, something cold and protective rise in him on behalf of a woman he had not yet met. He had told himself it was only distaste for dishonesty. He had told himself a great many things that first night that would not survive the morning. For in the morning he learned her name. Eleanor. He learned it in the yard, when the impossible happened, and his own fierce dog, who had savaged the last groom foolish enough to reach for him, laid his great head against a plain grey skirt and sighed like a creature come home. Dominic had not slept, and he was cold, and he was cynical to his bones, and he stood there in his borrowed coat and watched a woman he had come to buy be gentler with a frightened animal in 1 quiet minute than anyone had been to him in 5 long years. And Bran, who was the last living thing that had loved Clara, the pup she had chosen, the beast Dominic had kept, because putting him down would have been like burying her twice. Bran had chosen her. It undid something. He did not have a word for what it undid. He only knew that he watched the grey gown vanish through the kitchen door and could not, for the life of him, look away. He watched her all that day from the corners of the house, the way a servant may watch and never be seen, and what he saw dismantled him quietly, piece by piece. He saw her carry Cole up to the sick room where an old, forgotten great-aunt lay, though no one had asked her to, and he heard her read aloud to the old woman in a low, steady voice, until the querulous complaining stilled into sleep. He saw her settle a dispute between two quarreling under-maids with 3 calm words and no raised voice. He saw her, in the cold kitchen, quietly slip half her own bread to the boot boy, because the child was thin and growing, and the household stinted the servants' table. He saw her sit an hour with the drunken, weeping baronet, who was selling her like a mare, and hold his shaking hand, and forgive him without being asked, because she was the only one in that house with anything left to spare. And through it all she wore the plain grey gown, and no one thanked her, and she seemed to expect no thanks, and Dominic, who had thought himself frozen past all thawing, felt the ice in him give a single dangerous crack. He found reasons to be near her. It was absurd, in a man of his rank, a duke playing kindling boy, to linger in a ruined kitchen, and he knew it was absurd, and he did it anyway. He carried water she should not have carried. He mended a stable door latch that had hung broken for a season, and watched her notice it fixed, and watched her look about for who to thank, and say nothing when there was no one, only lay her hand a moment on the mended wood, as though it were a small kindness the house itself had done her. He learned the shape of her days. She rose before the maids, she saw to the horses, she kept the great-aunt, she kept the ledgers, she kept in 100 unregarded ways every soul at Farknoll fed and warm and standing, and not one of them saw it, because a thing done quietly every day becomes invisible, and Eleanor Ashworth had made herself invisible so thoroughly that her own family had forgotten she was the beating heart of the house. In the middle of that long grey afternoon, Dominic followed her out onto the moor. She had gone to walk the low field and look at the drainage she could not afford to mend, and he trailed her at a servant's distance, with the wolfhound ranging ahead through the frost-bleached heather, and he watched her stand at the edge of the flooded ground, with the wind pulling at her plain grey skirts, and her dark hair coming loose from its knot, and he thought she looked, in that bleak place, more a lady of the land than any powdered beauty he had ever partnered at a London ball. She crouched and put her bare hand into the cold standing water, and felt along the choked ditch with the unhurried competence of someone who had done it many times, and she said half to herself and half to the dog there, "It is only the old culvert gone under. 3 days' work and a load of stone, and this field would carry another 20 sheep. 3 days' work I have not got the money for." She straightened and dried her hand on her skirt, and looked out over the grey moor, with a face that held no pity for itself, only the steady weighing of a thing that could be done against a purse that could not do it. Dominic, 20 paces back, made a private and permanent resolution about a culvert, and about a great many other things. That evening in the servants' hall he sat among the household's own people, and listened to how they spoke of her, and it taught him more than a week of London gossip. Agnes, the kitchen maid, shy and thin, said Miss Eleanor had sat up 2 nights running, when Agnes had the fever last winter, when no one else would come near for fear of catching it. The boot boy said Miss Eleanor always found him the burnt bread ends nobody wanted, and pretended she preferred them herself so he might eat the good crust without shame. Old Thomas said nothing at all, But when a footman new to the house made a slighting joke about the grey ghost, Thomas set down his spoon and looked at the man until the man went quiet and red and left the hall. And that was eloquence enough. Dominic sat in the corner in his muddy coat and understood that the servants of Farknoll, who owed Eleanor Ashworth nothing and could gain nothing by her, loved her, and that there is no truer measure of a soul in all the world than how it is spoken of by the people it has no reason to be kind to. If Eleanor's story has drawn you in this far, then subscribe now, because what happens when the ice finally breaks, when the servant is unmasked and the whole household's cruelty comes down upon her, is the part I have been waiting to tell you. Stay with her. She is about to learn what she is truly worth, and so, God help him, is he. There is a moment coming in a cold stone hall that I have been turning over in my mind since the first line of this story, and I do not want you to miss it. That evening, the Duke of Velmoor did a thing he had not planned. He followed the plain grey daughter out to the stables at dusk, still in his servant's coat, because he could not stay away, and he found her there in the lantern light, brushing down the old grey mare and talking to her low and easy, the way she talked to all wounded things. Bran had gone ahead of him and lay already at her feet in the straw, and she did not startle at the sound of the man in the door. "Mr. Grey," she said without turning, "your dog has taken up residence in my stable. I hope you don't mind. He seems to prefer the horses to the house. I can't say I blame him." Dominic came in slowly. The lantern threw its warm amber light across her face, across the grey gown, and he thought, with a plainness that frightened him, that he had never in his life seen anything he wanted so much to protect. "He's a good judge of company," Dominic said. "Better than most people." She smiled at that, a real smile, small and tired and true, and went on with her brushing, and made room for him at the mare's flank without being asked, the way you make room for a person you have decided, without quite deciding it, to trust. So they talked. He had not meant to, but she made talking easy the way she made the horses easy. No performance in her, no angling, no fear. She asked him where he had served before, and he lied, and she saw the lie, and did not press it, only smiled a little and turned it aside. She asked instead about the dog, and he found himself telling her a truth wrapped in the lie, that Bran had belonged to someone his master had lost, and that no one had been able to touch the beast since, and that his master kept him though it broke something in him to look at him, because the alternative was worse. "Grief makes strange keepers of us," Eleanor said softly, and did not ask whose grief, and Dominic understood that she knew perfectly well it was his own. She spoke of the estate as one speaks of a person long loved and long ill, the drainage in the low field, the roof of the east wing, the tenants she could not bear to turn out, though the ledgers said she must. "You keep the books yourself," Dominic said, and it was not a question. "Someone must," she said. "My father cannot bear to look at them. I don't blame him for that either. It is a hard thing, to watch your whole world run out through your hands like water, and be able to do nothing but count it as it goes." She said it without self-pity, as a simple fact, and something in Dominic's chest ached that had not ached in 5 years. "You could have left," he said. "A woman with your sense. You could have gone for a governess, a companion, anything but stayed to be bled by a family that does not deserve you." Eleanor was quiet a long moment, her hand steady on the mare's warm neck. "They are my family," she said at last. "Deserving hasn't got much to do with it. You don't stop feeding the fire because the house is cold. You feed it because the house is cold. That's the whole of it, really. And tomorrow," he said carefully, "the Duke comes to make you his wife." He watched her face for the flinch, the calculation, the greed his rank always summoned. There was none. Eleanor set down the brush and rested her hand on the mare's warm neck, and was quiet a long moment. "Tomorrow a stranger comes to buy my family out of ruin," she said at last, "and I am the price. I know what I am, Mr. Grey. I have always known. I am not angry about it. It is only—" She stopped. "It is only what?" he asked, too quickly. She looked at him then, this servant she believed beneath her in station, with a gentle, tired honesty she would never have shown a duke. "It is only that I should have liked, once, to be chosen," she said. "Not needed, not settled for, not the plain one who came cheap. Chosen. But that is a girl's foolishness, and I gave it up a long time ago." And she picked up the brush again, and Dominic stood in the lantern light with his whole cold, careful life coming apart in his hands. He almost told her then. The words were in his mouth, "I am no servant. I am the man you fear, and I do not want a bargain. I want you." But the old fear closed his throat, the fear that had frozen him for 5 years, that to love again was to stand once more at a graveside in the spring, in the wet earth, with the whole world gone grey and silent. So he said nothing. He wished her a good night, and he took his dog, who did not want to come and had to be called twice, and he went back to the cold house and lay awake. And for the first time in 5 years he was not afraid of grief. He was afraid of losing something he had not yet dared to reach for, which is a stranger and sharper fear, and one that will not let a man sleep. He lay awake, and he thought of Clara, and he found with a guilt that surprised him and then, slowly, did not, that he could think of her now without the old drowning. He remembered how she had laughed, and how she had loved the dog, and how she had told him once, teasing, that he was too proud by half, and that some day a plainer, wiser woman than she would take him down a peg, and it would be the making of him. He had not been able to bear the memory for 5 years. Tonight he could. Tonight it felt almost like a blessing given from a long way off. He turned it over in the dark, and he thought of a grey gown and a steady voice, and a hand laid gentle on a beast no one else could touch, and he understood at last what he had ridden north to do, and how completely he no longer wished to do it. He had come to buy a wife. He was going to have to learn, and quickly, how to deserve one. But cruelty does not sleep, and the household's plot moved on beneath him. The next morning was the morning the Duke was to arrive, and Lady Ashworth, believing him still a day's ride distant, made her play. She had learned somehow from the whispering maids of the strange bond between the plain daughter and the fearsome new dog, and it had put a thought in her narrow, scheming mind. If Eleanor could be made to look wild, unwomanly, a keeper of savage beasts and low company, then surely the fastidious Duke would recoil, and in the space of that recoiling a prettier daughter might be slid into the empty place, and the coronet kept in the family after all. She sent for Eleanor to the drawing-room, and there before the assembled family and the pretty stepsisters she began. in her sweetest voice, to strip the girl bare. "Sit down, Eleanor, know there, where the light is honest. We must talk about tomorrow." Lady Ashworth's smile was a lovely thing and a terrible one. "You understand, I hope, what is at stake. This family's whole survival rests upon a duke's goodwill. And you, forgive me, child, someone must say it, you are not a thing that inspires goodwill. You are 28. You dress like a governess gone to seed. You spend your days in the muck of the stables with a dog that ought to be shot. Cassandra, tell her." And Cassandra, pretty and cruel, said, "Everyone in the county laughs at you, Ellie. They call you the grey ghost of Farknoll. The Duke will take one look and think we've played a joke on him. It would be a kindness to him, really, and to yourself, if you would only step aside and let one of us, let one of you, marry the man I am pledged to," Eleanor said, very quietly. "Yes, I understand the shape of it perfectly. You have not been subtle." For a moment, one cold, treacherous moment, the plot nearly worked, not upon the absent Duke, but upon Eleanor herself. Lady Ashworth was clever, and cruelty long practiced knows exactly where to press. She let a silence fall, and then she said, softer now, almost kind, which was the cruelest voice of all, "I say it only because I love you, Eleanor, in my way. Look at yourself. Would it not be a mercy to be spared, to let Cassandra take this cold bargain and stay here quietly with us, useful and safe, and never have to stand in a great cold hall before a great cold man who will look at you the way the whole county looks at you? You would be humiliated within a month. I am trying to save you from that. Step aside. It is what you were made for, the stepping aside." And Eleanor, who had built her whole life on the belief that she was plain and unwanted and made for the stepping aside, felt the old lie reach up and close its familiar hand around her heart, and for one moment she nearly believed it, nearly opened her mouth to say yes, yes, take it. I will go back to the horses where I belong. That was the darkest hour of it. Not the mockery, but the moment the mockery almost became her own voice. But she thought, in that moment, of a mended latch, and a beast that had laid its head against her skirts, and a tired stranger who had told her that his dog was a better judge of company than most people, she thought. Someone stood still for that dog, until it learned it need not guard against him. And she found she did not, after all, wish to spend the rest of her life stepping aside. She sat very straight, her hands folded, her face still as stone, and let it break over her like cold water. The way she had let 100 such mornings break over her. She had long ago learned the trick of it, to go somewhere quiet inside herself while the words fell, to think of the mare's soft nose, or the mended latch, or the way the amber lamplight had lain across a stranger's tired face the night before, and to let the cruelty pass through the empty place where her hopes had used to live, and find nothing there to wound. But this morning the trick did not quite work. This morning, for reasons she could not name, the words landed. Perhaps it was the servant in the muddy coat and the honest hour in the stable. Perhaps it was that she had said aloud, for the first time in years, the small forbidden wish, to be chosen, and saying it had cracked the seal on something. She sat, and she bled quietly, and she did not let them see it, and she thought, I am so tired of being small in this house. What none of them knew was that Mr. Grey, the Duke of Velmoor, stood just beyond the drawing-room door, come with a scuttle of coal for the fire, and heard every word. He had frozen in the corridor with the coal in his hands. He heard them mock her plainness. He heard them mock her kindness. He heard the stepmother say, with a little laugh, and the beauty of it is, she'll go quiet as a lamb, because she has no spirit in her, none at all. She has been beaten too plain and too poor to fight. And Dominic, standing in the dark passage with his knuckles white on the coal scuttle and the great grey dog gone stiff and silent at his side, felt the last of the ice go out of him all at once, and something else come in behind it, hot and clean and certain, that he had not felt in 5 years and had thought he would never feel again. It was not distaste now, it was fury on her behalf, and under the fury, plain as daylight, was love. And then he heard the one voice in that room that mattered. He heard Eleanor rise. He heard the small sound of her chair pushed back, and the stillness after it, and then he heard her say, in a voice low and steady and utterly without fear, "You may say what you like of my face, and of my gown, and of my age, for those are yours to mock, and God knows you have had years of practice. But you will not call me spiritless. I have held this house together for 6 years while you emptied its purse at the card tables. I have kept every soul under this roof fed and warm through 2 hard winters, including yours and yours and yours. I have sat with a dying woman you have not visited once. If that is having no spirit, then I pray God keep me spiritless to the end of my days, for I would rather be your grey ghost than your bright and empty daughters. Now I have horses to see to." And she walked out. She walked out of the drawing-room and straight into the man in the servant's coat, and the coal scuttle fell, black lumps scattering across the flagstones between them, and she stopped, mortified that a servant had heard her shame. Mr. Gray, but she got no further because he was looking at her in a way no man had ever looked at her. And there were, impossibly, tears standing in the eyes of this hard, strange man, and he said, "Very low, you asked last night to be chosen." And before she could answer, before she could breathe, from the great hall came the sound of carriage wheels on gravel and the shout of a footman, and the whole household erupting into panic, for the Duke of Velmoor's crested coach had come rolling up the drive a full day early, empty, its liveried outriders searching, its steward white-faced, and calling out a name up and down the frozen yard. Calling for his master. Calling, "Your Grace. Your Grace, where are you?" And Eleanor, standing frozen in the corridor with the spilled coal about her feet, saw the man before her go very still, saw the servant stoop go out of his shoulders, and something older and colder and grander rise up in its place, saw the great grey wolfhound cross the hall and take its place at his heel, as though it had always known, saw the whole terrible truth arrange itself in a single silent instant. The steward burst in, took one look at the man in the mud-stained coat, and dropped at once into a bow. "Your Grace, thank God. We feared you thrown from your horse. We feared—" "Peace, Harding," said Dominic, Duke of Velmoor, in a voice that filled the hall. "I am not lost. I have been exactly where I meant to be." And he turned to Eleanor in her faded grey gown, her hand still at her throat, the ground gone from under her, and the whole cruel, gasping household turned with him, and understood all at once precisely what they had done, and in front of whom they had done it. The silence in that hall was the loudest thing Eleanor had ever heard. Lady Ashworth had gone the color of ash. Cassandra's pretty mouth hung open. Maria had gripped her sister's arm. The baronet gripped the back of a chair as though the floor were tilting. Every cruel word they had spoken that morning, the grey ghost, the beast that ought to be shot, the plain stick with no spirit, the whole ugly little plot to shame her out of her own betrothal, hung in the cold air, and the man who had heard them all was the man whose goodwill their whole survival depended upon, and he was a duke, and he was looking at none of them. He was looking at Eleanor. "Your Grace," Lady Ashworth managed, dropping into a desperate curtsy, her voice gone high and sweet and pleading, had we known the honor. You must forgive the disorder. Of course my daughters have been longing to." "Which daughters?" said the Duke, without warmth, without raising his voice, and the quiet of it was worse than any shout. "Would those be, madam? The ones you have spent a fortnight teaching to make your stepdaughter look drab? Or the stepdaughter herself, who has spent 6 years keeping the roof over the heads of the very people now scrambling to disown her?" No one answered. There was no answer. Lady Ashworth's mouth worked, and no words came, and Dominic did not wait for them. He crossed the hall to Eleanor. The wolfhound went with him, and pressed once more against her grey skirts, and the sight of it, the fierce beast gentling to the plain girl, in front of them all, the truth of her worth made flesh, where no one could deny it, said what words could not. "I came here to inspect a bargain," Dominic said, quietly, so that only she could truly hear, though the whole hall strained toward them like reeds in a wind. "I came disguised so that no one would lie to me, and I have spent a day and 2 nights watching a house full of people show me exactly who they are when they believe no one who matters is looking. Your stepmother showed me her ambition. Your sisters showed me their spite. Your father showed me his shame, and I do not despise him for it, for shame at least is honest." He paused. "And you, Eleanor Ashworth, showed me the only honest heart under this roof, when you did not know a soul was watching, and when you had every reason on this earth to have grown as hard and cold as I am. You asked, last night, to be chosen. Not needed, not settled for." His voice went rough. "Chosen, Your Grace," Eleanor whispered, "you cannot. I am nothing. I am exactly what they said, plain and poor, and past my season, and everyone in the county knows it and laughs. You are a duke. You could have any beauty in England. There is no reason on this earth there is one," he said. "You saw me." She stared at him. "In the yard," he went on, "and in the stable, and in the corridor just now with the coal at your feet. You looked at a servant in a muddy coat, and you were kind to him, and honest with him, and you asked nothing of him, because you did not know he could give you anything. Do you understand how rare that is in my life? I am a duke. No one has looked at me and seen a man, only a man, in longer than I can remember. They see a coronet, they see a fortune, they see a thing to be won. You saw a tired stranger with a lonely dog, and you were gentle with us both, and it cost you nothing, and you did not know we were watching, and that is a thing that cannot be bought, or arranged or taught. My grandmother chose me 3 brides this past year," he said. "Bright, and beautiful, and suitable to the last inch. My dog growled at every one of them. He is the last living thing that loved someone I lost, and he has not let a stranger near him in 3 years, and he lay down at your feet in the first hour. Bran knew before I did. He always was the wiser of us. He took her cold hand in his there before them all, and the household watched their whole scheme turn to ash on the flagstones. I do not want a bargain, Eleanor. I never did, though I told myself I did because a bargain asks nothing of the heart, and my heart was a coward. I want the woman who fed a house that starved her of every kindness, and kept her spine straight anyway, and knelt in a cold yard for a beast no one else would go near. Marry me. Not to save Farknoll. Save Farknoll because I love you. And let that be the very least of the reasons. Eleanor Ashworth, who had not wept in years, who had learned to be useful and plain, and to expect nothing, stood in the cold hall of her ruined house with a duke's hand around hers and a fierce grey dog leaning warm against her, and felt 6 years of held breath go out of her all at once. She did not fall into his arms. That was not her way, and he would learn over the long good years to come that it was one of the things he loved best in her, that she met even joy with a steadiness that had to be earned before it opened. She looked up at him, searching his face for the lie, for the cruelty, for the trap, because a woman does not unlearn a lifetime of being made small in a single morning, and she found none. She found only a man who had been as frozen as she had been careful, thawing in front of her, terrified and honest and impossibly hers. You truly were listening, she said softly, all this time. Every hour, behind that muddy coat, every word, he said. It was the best day and a half of my life, and I very nearly ruined it by being too great a coward to say so in the stable last night. Then you know, she said, and the smallest, driest thread of humor came into her steady voice, that I do not come cheap after all. And Dominic, Duke of Velmoor, laughed, a rough, startled, unpracticed sound, the laugh of a man who had forgotten he could, and the whole hall flinched at it, for none of them had ever heard the great cold Duke of Velmoor laugh, and here he was doing it over the grey ghost of Farknoll. No, he said, when he could. You are the dearest thing in England, and I very nearly did not see it, and I will spend my life ashamed that I ever thought to buy a wife when I might have earned one instead. Say yes, Eleanor, not for them, not for the roof. Say yes because a lonely man and his lonelier dog rode north, expecting nothing, and found you, and cannot bear to ride away again. And Eleanor, quiet and steady and at long last, chosen, said yes. There was a reckoning, of course, though it was not the sort the household feared. Dominic did not rage. He did not turn the family into the road, though the law and his own fury would have let him. Eleanor would not have it. That very evening, when the two of them stood alone in the cold library, with a single candle and the great dog asleep between their feet, she had laid her hand on his arm and said, You must not punish them, not for my sake. I know too well what it is to be made small in front of a room, and I will not be the cause of it in another soul, not even them. Let them keep their dignity. It is the only thing left in this house worth more than the debts. And Dominic, who had ridden north, a man who believed the world was owed hardness for the hardness it had dealt him, looked at her a long moment in the candlelight, and understood that he was marrying someone far better than himself, and that the getting of her was the great undeserved mercy of his life. That same night, when Eleanor had gone up to sit her last watch with the failing great-aunt, Dominic sat alone in the cold library with the ledgers she had kept, and read them by a single candle, and what he found in that neat, unsparing hand humbled him further still. Every column balanced, every debt recorded to the shilling, every small economy, the turned gowns, the mended harness, the winters gone without a fire in her own room, so the servants might have coal in theirs, set down without complaint, as a simple accounting of a life spent holding a sinking thing above the water with her bare hands. He turned the pages, and he did the arithmetic she had done 1,000 times, and he saw exactly how near the whole estate had come to going under, and how long, and how quietly, one overlooked woman had kept it from doing so. In the morning he sent a rider south with instructions of his own, the culvert in the low field to be mended within the week, a load of good stone brought up, the east wing roof reslated before the spring rains, the worst of the tenants' arrears forgiven. He told no one it was done at his order. He wanted for once in his cold and privileged life to give a gift the way she gave hers, quietly and asking nothing, and letting the receiver believe, if they liked, that the house itself had simply decided to be kind. The Dowager Duchess came north for the wedding, and the county held its breath, for the old lady's tongue was famous and her approval was granted to almost no one. She arrived in a great black coach on a grey afternoon, climbed down stiff and sharp-eyed, and demanded at once to see the girl who has done what 3 beauties and I between us could not, and made my grandson behave like a man in love. Eleanor came to her plainly dressed and unafraid, and made her curtsy, and did not flatter, and answered the old woman's flint-hard questions straight. The dowager looked at her a long, piercing while, at the grey gown, at the steady grey eyes, at the great wolfhound that had planted itself at the girl's side, and would not be moved. Then she gave a short bark of a laugh. "Well," she said, to the whole assembled and terrified family, "so my grandson has found the one woman in England with more spine than I have. About time. The pretty ones bored him to death, and the ambitious ones I could not abide, and I had begun to think he would freeze solid in that great cold house of his, and take the whole line down with him. Come here, child. Let me look at you properly. Yes, you'll do. You'll do very well indeed. The overlooked ones always do. It is only that the fools of the world take so long to notice." They were married in the spring, in the small stone church at Farknoll, and it was not the wedding the county had gossiped about. There was no grand society crush, no ballroom, no display, no glittering crowd come to gawk at a duke throwing himself away on a nobody. There was a plain grey-eyed bride in a gown of soft dove-grey. She would not be talked out of the grey. It was, she said, the truest thing she owned, and Dominic said he would not have her in anything else for the world. There was a tall, dark duke who could not stop looking at her. There was an old groom named Thomas standing witness, with his hat crushed in his stiff hands, and something suspiciously bright in his weathered eyes. There was a housekeeper, Mrs. Graves, who had begun the winter cold as frost toward the plain daughter, and had thawed over the long strange season into fierce devotion, and who wept openly and unashamed through the whole of it. And there was a great iron-grey wolfhound, named Bran, lying across the church door like a guardian, letting no cruelty and no ill word pass, exactly where he had chosen from the first cold morning to be. Dominic had asked her once, in the weeks before, why she had gone to the dog in the yard when the whole house had warned her back. She had thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. Because he was frightened, she had said at last, and pretending to be fierce, and I know that trick. I have used it myself most of my life. You put your hackles up so no one will come close enough to see how much it hurts to be alone. I thought, if I could only stand still long enough and mean him no harm and ask him for nothing, he might learn he did not have to guard against me. She had looked up at him then and understood from the sudden stillness in his face that she had described him too, exactly, and that he knew it. You did the same to me, Dominic had said. Lo, you stood still, and you meant me no harm, and you asked me for nothing. And I laid my head down, and she had smiled and said, You are not so fierce, Your Grace. You are only lonely. I knew it the moment I saw you split the wood too well for a man who had ever truly had to. As for the others, they were displaced, not destroyed. Lady Ashworth found that a duke's charity, once extended to her stepdaughter, did not extend to her card tables. She retired to a small, neat house in Bath on a small, neat allowance, and was, in time, seldom spoken of, and if she ever grasped that she had schemed a duke into loving the very girl she meant to shame out of him, she never said so, and no one troubled to tell her. Cassandra and Maria were given respectable, modest settlements and modest, respectable husbands, far from Farknoll, and if they told the story of their sister the Duchess of Velmoor at all, they told it carefully, and left out their own part in it, as people do. The baronet Eleanor forgave, because she had already forgiven him long before. In the cold dining room over the guttering candle, he lived out his years quietly at Farknoll, in a wing with a mended roof, walking the low fields with the drainage at last put right. And if he had not been a good father, he became, late and humbly, a grateful one. And he wept at the christening of his first grandchild, and Eleanor let him, and held his shaking hand as she always had. None of them were humiliated. Eleanor would not have it, and Dominic, who was learning her, did not press. Farknoll itself was saved, but that was the least of what changed. The roof of the east wing was mended before the next autumn storms, and the tenants Eleanor could not bear to turn out stayed, and prospered, and named their daughters Eleanor. The old grey mare lived out her days fat and idle in the best pasture, and the stable that had been the warmest place in a cold house became the warmest place in a warm one, and the great cold house of Velmoor itself, when they went south to it, learned slowly what it was to have fires lit in every room, and a mistress who knew every servant's name, and a duke who laughed now, sometimes out loud, without meaning to. The frozen man had thawed, and the overlooked woman had been seen, and between the two of them they made of two grieving, guarded lives one warm and steady thing. The way you build a fire in a cold house, not because it is easy, but because the house is cold, and someone must, and it is worth the doing. Every evening, when the work was done, and the amber light came slanting low across the moor, the Duke and Duchess of Velmoor walked out together to the stables, with the great grey wolfhound loping ahead, and Eleanor would put on no airs and no jewels, only the plain grey shawl she loved, and Dominic would think, every single time, that he had come north to buy a bargain, and had instead been given the one thing his rank and his fortune and his grief had never been able to purchase, to be seen wholly, by someone who had wanted nothing from him at all, and who wanted nothing from him still, save his company in the fading light, and his hand steady over hers. He had learned from a woman in a grey gown that the heart does not thaw because it is commanded to, nor because it is bought, but because someone stands quiet and near and asks it for nothing, until it forgets, at last, that it was ever afraid. Years later, when they were both grey themselves, and the house was full of children who had never once heard their mother called the grey ghost of Farknoll, a young cousin newly come to the family asked the Duchess of Velmoor how it was that she, of all the beauties her husband might have had won a duke. And Eleanor, 28 no longer, took a long, quiet moment, and rested her hand on the head of an old grey wolfhound gone stiff and white at the muzzle, but still, always, at her feet. "I did not win him," she said at last. "I was only kind to a servant in a muddy coat on a cold morning when I thought no one of any consequence was watching. And it turned out that everyone of consequence was." She smiled, and there was no bitterness in it, none at all. Only the deep, settled peace of a woman who had waited a long time and had not, in the end, waited in vain. The overlooked one is not the shadow in the room, child. She is the light everyone else has simply learned to stop seeing. Be kind when you are certain it will cost you nothing and win you nothing, for that is the only hour anyone ever finds out who you truly are. The light was going gold over the moor. Dominic came in from the fields with the cold on his coat and stood in the doorway watching his wife, as he had stood watching her that first grey morning 28 years of her life and a whole frozen lifetime of his ago. And the old wolfhound thumped its tail once against the flagstones, and Eleanor lifted her eyes and found him there, and neither of them said anything at all. There was nothing that needed saying. She had asked once in a cold stable in the lantern light, only to be chosen, and she had been. Chosen, and seen, and loved, not for a fortune, not for a face, but for the plain and steady and unbought truth of her, the grey-gowned girl who had knelt in the yard for a lonely dog no one else would go near. Thomas had known it. Mrs. Graves had known it. The sharp old dowager had known it in a single glance. And Bran had known it before any of them, before even Dominic himself, on a cold grey morning when he crossed a frozen yard and laid his great head down and chose her. Dominic, Duke of Velmoor, who had very nearly not seen it at all, breathed out quiet and steady in the gold and fading light, and thanked God every single day of his long good life that he had come to Farknoll dressed as a servant, because a duke would only ever have been lied to. And it was the servant, in the end, who had been given the truth.